It was one of those grey mornings in the city, the kind where the sky seemed unsure if it wanted to rain or just hang low and heavy. The glass doors of Ashton and Cole's headquarters gleamed under the weak light, the kind of place where everything smelled faintly of polished marble and power. Inside, Samuel Hart, CEO, 42, crisp navy suit, the kind of posture that said he was used to being listened to, was reviewing his morning schedule when he noticed the commotion at the security desk. A man stood there, tall but slightly hunched, as if life had pushed him down over the years. His jacket was worn, the knees of his jeans faded, and his hands kept tightening around the strap of an old backpack. His hair, dark but streaked with grey at the temples, was messy from the wind, and in his eyes, something between desperation and hope. Double quotes, "Sir, you can't just come in without an appointment." The receptionist's voice was polite but firm. "I know," the man said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. I need to see Mr. Hart. Please, tell him it's about something personal." From the mezzanine above, Samuel could hear every word. This wasn't unusual. People often tried to bypass protocols, hoping their cause would move him, but it never worked. He'd built his career on control, on not letting emotions steer his decisions. Still, something about the way the man's voice carried low, sincere, unpolished, made Samuel pause. He walked to the balcony railing and looked down. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and the man's grip on the backpack tightened. "Mr. Hart," the man called up, "please, just 5 minutes." Samuel felt the weight of the morning pressing on him. Meetings, deadlines, the annual report. He shook his head slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, voice even but distant. "If you have a proposal, please send it to the appropriate department." "It's not a proposal," the man said quickly, taking a step forward before the security guard gently blocked him. "It's about you, and something you don't know." Samuel hesitated. People had said all sorts of strange things to him over the years, some flattery, some accusations, some too bizarre to recall. But the way this man said it, it wasn't a bluff. It was more like a truth he'd been carrying for a long time. "Please," the man said again, softer now. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." Samuel exhaled, feeling the familiar wall of his self-discipline rise. He had no space in his schedule for whatever this was. He turned, ready to head back to his office, and that was when the man added, almost under his breath, "You don't remember me, but years ago, I saved your life." The words stopped Samuel mid-step. He glanced back, his brow furrowed. The man didn't look like someone playing a trick. His hands trembled slightly, as if the act of coming here had cost him something. In his eyes, there was no arrogance, only an odd mix of exhaustion and quiet certainty. Samuel didn't reply. He simply walked back into his office, leaving the man in the lobby. But as the elevator doors closed, his mind wouldn't stop replaying that one sentence. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to follow the story. Leave a comment if you've ever had a moment when a stranger claimed something that changed how you saw your own past. The elevator rose to the top floor, but Samuel barely noticed the smooth hum of the machinery. That man's words had lodged themselves somewhere deep in his thoughts, refusing to be ignored. He entered his office, a wide space of glass and dark wood, with a panoramic view of the city's skyline. His assistant, Claire, was already there, holding a folder. "Your 9:30 meeting," she began, but stopped when she saw his expression. "Is everything all right?" Samuel nodded automatically, but his mind wasn't in the room. He took the folder from her, setting it down without opening it. "Claire," he said after a pause, "who was the man downstairs?" She looked surprised. "I'm not sure, he didn't give a last name. Said his first name was Daniel, mid-40s maybe." Seemed persistent. Daniel, the name felt familiar, though Samuel couldn't place it. He was certain he didn't know many people in their 40s who wore jeans faded from years of wear, or carried backpacks instead of briefcases. "Did he leave anything?" Samuel asked. "Just this," Claire said, handing him a small, creased envelope. His name was written on it, not in the neat, practiced handwriting of a professional, but in uneven strokes, as if the writer's hand had trembled. Samuel slipped a finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The writing inside was short. "I don't want money. I don't want anything from you. I just need to talk. Please remember that night in the rain, 12 years ago, the one you never told anyone about, Daniel." Samuel stared at the words, his pulse quickening. 12 years ago. A rainy night, his mind drifted back unwillingly to an image he'd buried for more than a decade. Slick asphalt, flashing headlights, the smell of wet concrete, and a voice shouting his name. But that was impossible. No one had been there. He'd convinced himself of that long ago. He folded the note and slipped it into his desk drawer, shutting it with a quiet click. "Tell security he can't come back without an appointment," Samuel said finally. "Yes, sir," Claire replied, though her eyes lingered on him as if she sensed something was off. For the rest of the morning, Samuel threw himself into meetings and calls, determined to push the encounter from his mind. But every time he caught sight of the city beyond the glass, it was as if the rain from 12 years ago blurred his vision again. By late afternoon, his resolve had worn thin. He told himself it was only curiosity. A CEO needed to verify when someone used words like "saved your life." It wasn't personal. He picked up the phone and called security. "If Daniel comes back tomorrow," Samuel said, "let him in." When he hung up, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the city lights beginning to blink on. He didn't realize it yet, but opening that door, even a little, was about to change far more than just his day. The next morning came with a clear sky, the kind that made the city look sharper, more awake. Samuel arrived earlier than usual, coffee in hand, but his focus was already fractured. By 9, he'd read the same email 3 times without absorbing a single sentence. The moment the security desk called to say Daniel had arrived, a strange knot formed in his chest. "Send him up," Samuel said, his voice steady, though his fingers tightened around his pen. Minutes later, the door opened. Daniel stepped in quietly, removing his backpack as if it might make him seem less imposing. Up close, Samuel noticed the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the faint smell of laundry soap that clung to his jacket. "Mr. Hart," Daniel said, his tone careful. "Thank you for letting me come back." Samuel gestured toward the leather chair across from his desk. "You said you saved my life," he began. "Explain." Daniel nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this question for years. "It was 12 years ago. March. Heavy rain. You were driving near Harbor Street, just past midnight. Your car skidded on the slick road and hit the guardrail. You were trapped. I was walking home from my shift, saw the crash, and pulled you out before the car caught fire." Samuel's brow furrowed. The memory was there, faint and jagged. He remembered the crash, the shattering glass, the airbag, the smell of gasoline, but he had always believed he'd climbed out himself, that no one had been there. "How do I know you're not just making this up?" Samuel asked. Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out a small warped piece of metal, a keychain, shaped like an anchor, burned along one edge. "It was on the ground next to you," Daniel said, placing it on the desk. "I've kept it all these years. I figured one day I might get the chance to give it back." Samuel stared at it. It was his, a gift from his father when he graduated college. He thought he'd lost it in the crash. "I didn't go to the police, didn't go to the news," Daniel continued. "I didn't want anything from you then, and I don't want anything now, except..." He hesitated, glancing down at his hands. "I need help, not for me, for my son." Samuel leaned back, studying him. "Your son?" Daniel nodded. "Ethan. He's 12, smart kid, loves science, but he's been sick. The kind of sick that's hard to get the right treatment for without good insurance, and I've tried everything I can on my own." There it was, the plea Samuel had been expecting. Yet it didn't sound like a demand. It sounded like a man who had carried pride as far as it could take him and finally had to set it down. Samuel's instinct was to remain detached, to remind himself he didn't owe anyone, even the man who might have pulled him from a burning car, a personal favor. But that anchor keychain on his desk seemed to weigh more than it should. Samuel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the keychain, the little anchor catching the light as if it were trying to remind him of something beyond logic. "What exactly are you asking for?" Samuel finally said. Daniel sat forward, elbows on his knees, his voice measured. "There's a clinic not far from here, with a specialist who can help Ethan. But the treatment isn't covered under my insurance. I can't afford it. I'm not asking for a blank check. I'm asking for a way in, a job, something steady enough so I can take care of him without drowning in bills." It was strange. Most people in Samuel's position heard requests like this often. Usually, the ask came wrapped in flattery, an inflated resume, or a sob story that felt rehearsed. But Daniel's words were unpolished, almost stubborn in their simplicity, "And why come to me?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. Daniel met his gaze evenly. "Because I figured if I'd pulled you out of a burning car, you might give me 5 minutes to explain why I'm desperate." Silence filled the space between them. Out on the streets below, cars moved like silver insects along the morning commute, their tiny shapes oblivious to the conversation happening 30 floors above. Samuel's mind wandered back to the crash, the rain, the metallic taste in his mouth, the moment he thought he wouldn't get out, and then the faint memory of strong hands pulling at the door, a voice shouting, "You're gonna be okay." He'd told himself for years that was his own mind fighting to stay awake, but now the memory felt less like a dream and more like a truth he hadn't wanted to face. "I can't just give jobs away," Samuel said finally. "We have procedures, interviews, requirements." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm not asking for a handout. I'm willing to work any position. Nights, cleaning, whatever's open, I'll earn it." The stubbornness in Daniel's tone made something in Samuel shift. Pride, resilience, a refusal to play the victim. Still, years of business instinct told him to keep his guard up. "Leave your contact information with Claire. I'll see what I can do." Daniel nodded once, stood, and placed the anchor keychain closer to Samuel's side of the desk. "It's yours. Always was." When he left, the office felt oddly empty. Samuel sat there, the keychain in his palm, the cool metal warming against his skin. That evening, as he prepared to leave, Samuel found himself lingering at his desk. He opened his laptop and searched for Harbor Street accident, March 12. Years ago, there it was, a small local news article. Driver rescued from burning car after crash in heavy rain. No names, no photos, just one line. An unidentified passerby pulled the man to safety. Before the vehicle ignited, Samuel leaned back, the truth settling in his chest like a weight and a question all at once. Samuel told himself he was only thinking about Daniel because the encounter had been unusual. But over the next 2 days, the man kept surfacing in his thoughts, in the quiet moments between meetings, when the office emptied out and the city lights glowed against the glass dot. By the third morning, he asked Claire casually, "Has Daniel been in touch?" She shook her head. "No, he left a number. Said he wouldn't bother you unless you called." That restraint, Samuel realized, was rare. Most people in Daniel's position would be calling, emailing, showing up. Instead, Daniel had stepped back, letting the choice rest entirely with him. Samuel opened the drawer and picked up the anchor keychain again. The metal was scratched, but solid, much like the man who'd returned it. Without thinking too long about it, Samuel dialed the number. "Hello." Daniel's voice came, cautious but steady. "It's Samuel Hart," he said. "I need you to come in tomorrow. HR will set up an interview. I can't promise anything, but I think we can find a role for you." There was a pause, the kind that felt full of unspoken gratitude and unasked questions. "Thank you," Daniel said simply. The next day, Daniel arrived in a clean shirt and a pair of slacks that didn't quite fit but were clearly the best he owned. The interview was quick. By the end of the week, he was officially on staff as a facilities assistant, late shifts, handling maintenance and cleaning. It wasn't glamorous, but it came with full benefits. Samuel told himself it was a business decision. But the truth was, when he'd seen Daniel shake hands with HR and walk out of that office with a quiet smile, he'd felt something loosen. Inside him, something he didn't even realize had been tight for years. Weeks passed. Samuel would occasionally see Daniel in the hallways late in the evening. They never spoke much beyond polite nods, but Samuel noticed the man's work was careful, thorough. He didn't cut corners. One night, as Samuel was leaving, he saw Daniel in the lobby, holding a small paper bag. "Ethan's favorite dinner," Daniel said, smiling faintly. "We eat together every night, no matter what." Samuel just nodded, but after he got in his car, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. It had been a long time since he'd heard someone talk about family like that, not as an accessory, but as the center of their world, and for reasons he couldn't name. That thought stayed with him all the way home. If this story has you wondering what Samuel will do next, make sure to keep following along. Leave a comment if you've ever met someone who quietly changed the way you see life. It started with a small gesture. Samuel had stayed late one Friday night, finishing a proposal. When he finally stepped into the elevator, he saw Daniel pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. "Late night," Samuel remarked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Always is on Fridays." I try to get the floors spotless before the weekend. Makes Monday easier for everyone. Samuel nodded, but as the doors opened on the ground floor, he noticed something. Daniel had a worn paperback sticking out of his backpack. The cover was bright and illustrated, the kind of thing meant for children. For Ethan? Samuel asked before he could stop himself. Daniel looked slightly embarrassed, but nodded. He likes bedtime stories. Says it helps him sleep. I don't want him to think about hospitals when he's supposed to dream. There was something in that sentence that made Samuel pause. He'd grown up in a house where bedtime stories were replaced by long silences and the distant click of his father's study door. He didn't know what it felt like to be read to every night by someone who wanted to be there. The following week, Samuel found himself thinking about Ethan more often than he expected. He didn't know what the boy looked like, but he pictured a thin, bright-eyed kid who loved science and carried the quiet resilience of his father. One rainy Thursday evening, Samuel stayed later than usual. On his way out, he spotted Daniel in the lobby, standing by the revolving door. He was holding an umbrella in one hand and looking out at the rain with that same mix of patience and tiredness. Waiting for someone? Samuel asked. Ethan, Daniel said. He likes to meet me halfway when I get off work. But I told him to stay home tonight, too wet, so I'll just walk to him instead. Samuel hesitated. The thought of Daniel walking through the rain after a long shift didn't sit right with him. Do you need a ride? Daniel shook his head quickly. I appreciate it, but we're fine. I'm used to it. And just like that, he stepped into the downpour, disappearing into the blur of streetlights and wet asphalt. That image stayed with Samuel all night. By morning, something had shifted in him, an awareness that there was a whole other world just a few blocks from his own, where love was measured, not in luxury, but in showing up. He wasn't sure why, but he wanted to see that world for himself. It happened almost by accident. The following Saturday, Samuel was driving through the older part of the city, narrow streets, lined with aging brick buildings and small corner shops. He wasn't sure what had drawn him there until he saw a familiar figure ahead, carrying a paper bag and moving with an easy but tired gait. Samuel slowed his car and pulled over. Need a lift? He called out through the open window. Daniel looked surprised, then smiled faintly. You have a habit of showing up when I least expect it. Samuel didn't press. Daniel climbed in, balancing the bag on his lap. The smell of fresh bread filled the car. Saturday tradition, Daniel explained. Ethan loves the bakery on 8th Street. I work late during the week, so we try to make weekends special. Samuel nodded, steering the car through winding blocks, until Daniel pointed to a modest apartment building 3 stories, paint fading, the kind of place that carried the sounds of its neighbors through the walls. You want to come up? Daniel asked hesitantly. Ethan's been curious about you. For a moment, Samuel considered politely declining, but curiosity and something else, something quieter, made him say yes. Inside, the apartment was small but warm. A few houseplants lined the window, and the walls were dotted with Ethan's drawings, rockets, planets, and one that Samuel realized was meant to be a solar system with the planets labeled in a child's careful handwriting. Ethan appeared from the hallway, barefoot and grinning. He was smaller than Samuel expected, his dark hair falling into his eyes. But there was a quickness to his gaze, the kind of alertness that made you think he was always connecting dots no one else saw. You're the boss, Ethan said. Matter-of-factly. Samuel smiled despite himself. That's one way to put it. Over lunch, bread from the bakery, soup simmered on the stove. Samuel found himself listening more than speaking. Ethan talked about a science fair at school, about his favorite constellation, and about how his dad always kept his promises. It was during a lull in the conversation that Samuel noticed the medication bottles lined neatly on the counter. The labels were filled with long words he didn't fully understand, but their presence spoke volumes. After a while, Samuel stood to leave. Thank you for having me, he said. Ethan grinned. Come back sometime. Dad doesn't have many friends. Who smiled. On the drive home, Samuel realized that the small apartment had felt more alive than his penthouse ever did, and for the first time in years, he wondered if success had cost him something he didn't know he'd lost. It was almost midnight when Samuel's phone rang. He rarely received personal calls at that hour, and even more rarely answered them, but when he saw Daniel's name on the screen, something in his gut told him to pick up. Samuel. Daniel's voice was tight, breathless. I'm sorry to bother you this late, But it's Ethan, he collapsed. We're at St. Mary's Hospital. Samuel was already pulling on his coat before the call ended. The streets were empty, the traffic lights blinking in their late-night rhythm. By the time he reached the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of fluorescent lights hit him like a wave. He found Daniel in the pediatric wing, pacing. His hands were clenched, his face pale. "They're running tests," Daniel said quickly. "He's been more tired lately, but tonight, he just couldn't stay awake. I called an ambulance." Samuel wanted to say something reassuring, but the words didn't come. Instead, he followed Daniel into the small room where Ethan lay in the bed, an IV snaking from his arm, his skin pale against the hospital sheets. The boy opened his eyes faintly when he saw them. "Hey, Dad," he whispered. Daniel's face softened, his hand smoothing Ethan's hair. "I'm right here, buddy." A doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Collins," he asked, glancing at Daniel. "We've stabilized him for now, but he needs more comprehensive treatment. I know you've been to the clinic before. I'm afraid we can't delay any more." Daniel's voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the strain. "How much will it cost?" The doctor hesitated before naming a figure. It was the kind of number that could break a working man's back. Samuel didn't speak right away. He looked at Ethan, this boy who'd never known him until a few weeks ago, but had smiled at him like they'd been friends forever, and felt something shift inside. When Daniel stepped into the hallway to make a call to his sister, Samuel followed. "Let me take care of it," Samuel said quietly. Daniel shook his head instantly. "I can't let you do that. This isn't your responsibility." Samuel met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe not, but you once pulled me out of a burning car. Whether you wanted it or not, that made me part of your story. Now I'm choosing to be here." Daniel's voice caught, and for a moment, all the walls he carried seemed to drop. "You don't know what this means." Samuel simply nodded. "I think I do." The following days moved in a blur. Paperwork was signed, calls were made, and Samuel quietly took care of the bills that would have swallowed Daniel whole. He didn't announce it, didn't want it to feel like a transaction. Daniel noticed, of course. One evening, as they sat in the hospital cafeteria with lukewarm coffee between them, he finally said, "I don't know how to repay you." Samuel shook his head. "I'm not keeping a ledger. This isn't about owing." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "That night, 12 years ago, I wasn't supposed to be there either. I'd just been fired from my job, was walking home in the rain because I couldn't afford the bus. I was angry at the world, at myself. And then I saw your car hit the guardrail." Samuel kept his eyes on the table, the memory replaying in fragments. "I didn't think," Daniel continued. "I just ran, pulled the door open, unbuckled you, and dragged you out. When the car went up, I remember thinking, maybe that's why I was there. Maybe I was supposed to be." Samuel's throat tightened. For years, he had told himself that the crash was just a bad night, a random stroke of bad luck. He had never considered that someone else had walked away from it, carrying a piece of the weight. "You'd never tried to contact me?" Samuel asked. Quietly, Daniel shrugged. "What would I have said? Hey, I saved your life, now what?" I figured if it mattered, life would find a way to cross our paths again. And somehow, it had. By the end of the week, Ethan was moved out of ICU and into a recovery room. His energy was still low, but the color was coming back to his cheeks. Samuel visited most evenings, sometimes bringing books or puzzles. One night, Ethan looked up from a puzzle piece and asked, "Are you my dad's best friend now?" The question caught Samuel off guard. He glanced at Daniel, who only smiled faintly. "I'd like to be," Samuel said, and meant it. It was a strange kind of peace, sitting there in that small hospital room, the hum of the machines, the low light, the quiet understanding that sometimes the people we end up tied to aren't the ones we choose, but the ones who show up when the world catches fire. And for Samuel, it was the first time in a long while that he felt like the weight he carried might be shared. 3 weeks later, Ethan was discharged. His steps were slow, his voice still a little tired, but his smile came easier now. Daniel walked beside him, one arm ready in case his son stumbled. Samuel followed a step behind, carrying the bag of hospital papers and medication like a silent sentinel. Outside, the air felt different, crisp. With the promise of spring, they drove back to Daniel's small apartment. But the moment they stepped inside, Samuel's gaze swept over the space. The couch was worn thin, the kitchen light flickered, and the heater clanged like it was protesting every degree it gave. "You're staying with me," Samuel said matter-of-factly. Daniel blinked. "What? My place has space. Ethan needs rest. You need to not worry about rent for a while. Let me make up for some of the years I didn't know you." Daniel hesitated, pride flickering in his eyes, but then he looked at Ethan, who was already sinking into the couch, pale from the short walk. "All right," he murmured. "Just don't treat us like charity." Samuel's smile was small, but warm. Never. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Samuel had known. Mornings were no longer silent. They were filled with the sound of Daniel making coffee and Ethan tapping his spoon against his cereal bowl. In the evenings, they'd watch movies or sit on the balcony, talking about everything and nothing. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Daniel stepped out onto the balcony where Samuel was staring at the city lights. Daniel said, "I've thought about that night in the rain, about how it all could have gone differently, but maybe this was the only way it could go. Maybe you were meant to knock on my door, and I was meant to be standing there, whether you knew me or not." Samuel exhaled slowly, the truth of it settling in his chest like something that had been waiting years to land. "Maybe we've both been knocking on each other's doors for a long time, just didn't hear it until now." They stood in silence for a moment, the city humming around them. Inside, Ethan stirred in his sleep, safe in the next room, and for the first time since that night 12 years ago, Samuel felt like the circle had finally closed, not with debt or repayment, but with family, built in the most unexpected way. If this story touched your heart, consider liking the video, subscribing for more real-life inspired stories, and sharing it with someone who believes in second chances.